and welcome to Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres, episode 205. Sorry, I just need to turn that down. Here we go, 205 episodes in, still getting tripped up by the technology. So yes, welcome. Today we're going to be talking about macro photography. I'll be explaining what macro photography is, giving examples, talking through how it gets affected by different kinds of lenses, all this kind of stuff. So stick around. Meanwhile, if you happen to be watching live, leave a comment down below or off to one side. I'm not sure, depending on where it appears on your screen, there is a chat box. Say hello, tell me you're here, tell me what you're up to, tell me what the weather's doing. Let's get the chat going. And press that one. Yes, hello. So here we are today talking about macro photography. I see we've got a couple of people in already, so let's have a little kind of hello. So Susan says hello from a beautiful summer's day in Kakubri. I'm even having an ice cream. Lovely, rather jealous of that ice cream. It is a perfect day for ice cream here in southwest Scotland. Feels like a summer's day. Also feels like we've had precious few of those this summer in Scotland. VG says, good evening everyone. Janet says hi from a warm, cloudy Mississauga. Sandra says hi everyone from a hot and sunny Birmingham. John says good day from Columbus, Ohio, where the weather is fantastic. And Marilyn says hello from Colorado. And Robert says howdy all from Texas. Sunny and hot, very hot. It's Texas in August. Right, okay, so Texas in August is obviously quite a bit hotter than Scotland in August. So welcome everybody. So what are we going to talk about today? Today we're going to talk about the notion of macro photography. So what is macro photography? Well, most of you already know probably, but it's close up. But it's more than close up. I suppose the point where it becomes the definition of macro photography is where you have a ratio of 1:1 or bigger. So what I mean by that is, generally speaking, you take a photograph of something and whatever you've taken the photograph of is smaller than the thing itself. So you take a photograph of a person, the person's only maybe this big. In real life, of course, they're full size, but the photo's smaller. But in macro photography, the idea is that when you take a photo of something, that it's pretty much a life size or it's bigger than life size. So a ratio of 1:1 would mean absolutely exactly life size. Bigger than life size or life size, that's your crossover point. That's where it stops being ordinary photography or close-up photography and becomes macro photography. So, okay, that's the definition. So today I'm going to be talking about that. I'm going to be talking about the idea of how you can do it, what a macro lens is, some of the kind of advantages and disadvantages, but also what you can do if you don't actually have a macro lens on your camera, because there are ways that sometimes you can get round that. So that's really what we're going to be chatting about. But like I say, if you happen to be watching live, leave questions. If you've got any questions, burning questions, or you've got insights, or you've got ideas, or you've anything, just keep the chat going. It's always a bit of fun. There was a space here potentially for people to send in images for feedback. Nobody sent anything in this week. Next week there will be more options for feedback, but I will talk about that at the end of the program. So today is just macro photography and whatever you happen to leave in the comments. So where shall we start with this then? In fact, I'll tell you what we could do just before, just a quick update on the Smug Points. On the Smug Points Leaderboard for August, because we've only had one. Last week was an August one, so actually VG is in fact in the lead for the August with 25 points. And everybody else who is currently on the leaderboard has about 5 points, I think. With that, for the third quarter, which we're running into, Robert is on 95, VG is on 85, April's on 70, and Sandra and Janet are on 60. So still plenty to play for that. So that's where we're kind of sitting with the Smug Points. So let's return then to macro photography. And let's give you a few examples then of macro photography. So where should we start? I'll tell you, back during lockdown, I bought myself a macro lens. I'd been toying around with it for a while, and then suddenly we were in lockdown, couldn't go out and do the usual kind of photography, found myself photographing things in the garden quite a lot, and I thought I'd really like to get in close. I'd really like to do something about that. And so I remember I unpacked the macro lens, and the very first image that I took, where are we? I do that and then that, was straightforwardly the lens cap. I thought, well, okay, I took the lens cap off, turned the camera on it, and took a photo of the lens cap. And as you can see from this, it's bigger than the lens cap. Okay, so if we're talking about that notion of what macro photography is the image is larger than the thing itself, we can, now obviously I suppose it kind of depends on your device. If you're only looking at this on a tiny little phone, then actually this is going to appear smaller than the lens cap. So where's the definition come in? You know what I mean. We don't have to get pedantic here. And one of the other things that was immediately noticeable about the lens cap was that it was a very, very narrow depth of field. You can see with this Canon here that the only bits that are in focus are kind of the edge of the A and the beginning of the N. And in fact, when we move in, we even see that the edge of the A isn't really there, and we've only got a bit of the edge of the N. And then there's this tiny little line where you can see in focus, out of focus. I mean, we're really talking about a couple of millimeters, 2, maybe 3 millimeters of depth of field. Now in this one, I had it set for a 3.5 f-stop of 3.5. And whilst on my normal lens, I mean, obviously 3.5 tends to give you a narrower depth of field. You've got a wider aperture. On a wide angle lens, 3.5 can give you quite a bit. But when we also know that with a zoom, the more you zoom in on something, the narrower your depth of field gets. And a macro lens, now this macro lens, and it's not dissimilar to a lot of other macro lenses, my macro lens is a 100mm lens. So it's a 100mm lens, so it's kind of zoomed in. It's you can't adjust it, it's a prime lens, but it's got quite a zoom on it already, and so that squeezes up and narrows the depth of field. The next thing about a macro lens, of course, is you tend to be close up. And you'll also know, or you may remember, some of you may remember with notion of depth of field, when you zoom in, it also depends on how far away the object is. If you're photographing a tree, say that's on the other side of the field, then zooming in, zooming out, your depth of field isn't going to make a lot of difference to how much of that tree is in focus. But if you're close up to that tree and you zoom in, then the depth of, you know, a single branch, a single leaf can make a difference in where the depth of field is. So with a macro lens, you have that combination of the fact that you're zoomed in and you're close, and this tends to give you a very, very narrow depth of field. Now, on the one hand, that means it's great for if you're wanting to have that kind of bokeh effect where you want to isolate something and clear out all the extraneous bits, go a little bit minimalism, go a little bit negative space. This is great for that. However, sometimes when you're really trying to get into the little detail, you can run into the problem of the fact that there's not enough depth of field to really show up what you're trying to show up. In which case, you then have to go for a much narrower aperture to compensate for that. So, okay, so fine. This is a shot of a Canon thing, but not really particularly interesting. Well, of course, the next thing I did was I went into the garden and probably spent the best part of a week chasing bees on flowers, because this was the kind of macro shot that I really wanted. And so when we come to something like this, what have I got? I've now put the f-stop on f5.6, and what am I shooting at there? 160th of a second, which was kind of, I mean, the bees were really fast. I took a lot of bee photos. The thing is that the other problem with the macro lens is you've zoomed in, you've got narrow aperture, and so when you start going for a narrower aperture, you really have a problem with light very quickly. I mean, this was an ISO of 2,500. So the narrower I'm going to go, the higher the ISO is going to be. So you're constantly looking for a balance, and that's not always easy to find. And you have to kind of play around with the balance of how much ISO, how high are you going to go when you're also trying to get a deeper depth of field. I mean, within this, we've got the bee, as we can see, much bigger than life size, thankfully. I'd be really worried if bees were actually this size. But within this, we can see the bee on the flower. As I zoom in, we can see that, you know, there's a bit of like the little hairs on the belly, I was going to call it. It's not the belly, there is a word for it. But on this part are really sharp. But the wing here, the front of the wing, is out of focus. The hair just on the back here is nice and sharp. The front of the eye is just starting to go out of focus. We can even see on the flower here that different parts of the flower, that bit's nice and sharp. This bit completely out of focus, that bit completely out of focus. And so very, very narrow depth of field. So again, we're probably only talking about 3 or 4, maybe 5 millimeters, probably only actually about 3 millimeters or something like that, depth of field on something like this. And what I found is even when I had managed to photograph bees to put on the flowers, say it might have caught the front of the wing, which looked nice, except for the fact that the head was out of focus. And we know when we've talked before that by and large, there are exceptions, but mostly if you're photographing an animal, an insect, a person, some kind of living creature, then the eye tends to be the bit that you and certainly the head has got to be the bit that's in focus. And there was enough of the eye in focus here for me to be able to get away with it, I think. So this then was my kind of pride and joy photo. I was delighted that I finally managed to get this kind of photo. So Susan said, would it be okay to set the ISO auto for this shot of the bee? Absolutely, and it's exactly what I did. These things are moving around so fast, everything's going, that really you want to be on, just ISO auto is your best option for this, unless you are in very, very controlled conditions. But generally speaking, something like a bee, you're outside, you're moving between sunshine and shade, depending even the flower itself, even if it's a general overcast day, depending on whether it's under or to the side, the light is going to be moving so fast, and if you're trying to adjust your ISO the entire time, you're going to run into problems. So I would say put it on auto ISO, but go and check, take a few photos and check. And if you're finding that the ISO is consistently coming out just way too high for what you want, start playing around. The problem is, like I say, if you go for a wider aperture, you end up with even less depth of field, and the chances of getting the shot in focus at the point you want it is even harder. So this kind of moving thing is really difficult. So what have we got? So that was Susan who asked about the ISO. Sandra says, I have a macro lens, but I struggle to use it. I find I end up with lots of blurred photos despite using a tripod and a 2-second delay. I also use the autofocus as I don't trust my eyes. Yeah, autofocus, and again, that's going to kind of depend on the camera and everything else. Trying to, using a tripod, again, maybe start with something which is static. That's really where you might find it a little bit easier. Okay, let's show you a couple of other photos. I mean, here's another bee on a flower, which again, felt quite pleased with. But again, you know, I've managed to just about get the sharpness around here onto the shoulder, but the wings themselves are out of focus. It's not 100%. I mean, it's one of these things which, if this was a printed up image, you probably go, it's not quite sharp enough. Really, the sharp point, if we look at this, is this bit of the flower. So just fractionally in front of the bee. However, when you're pulled out, you can't really notice that. And as a kind of photo that appears occasionally on things like PhotoCrowd or ViewBug or Guru Shots or whatever, this one tends to do reasonably well because we can see it's a bee and there's a nice contrast between the yellow of the bee and the purple of the flower. So you can get away with it. So there's levels at which you can get away with things which are only ever going to be seen on a screen, that maybe if you wanted to get it printed up and you were selling prints of these things, you would have to be far more accurate with. So what else can you do? Well, the other way to go is to potentially go for is to go for something a bit more static. So Daisy you know, little flowers. Now, again, you've kind of either got to take it indoors, or you've got to kind of hope that it's not a windy day, because windy day, slight bits of movement, you think you've got it in focus, slightest breeze forward or back, because you've got such a narrow depth of field, boom, disappears. Or where else do we go? Something like dandelions. Dandelions. These are the perfect thing to play around with. What's really interesting about dandelions is the fact that because you've got all the little seed heads and what have you, depending on whether you're to the front or to the side, you can focus on different places forward and back and get entirely different shots depending on whether you're focusing in the middle or you're focusing on the front or you're focusing on the back. The whole thing kind of appears quite different. So to get hold of a dandelion head like this is one to play with. Now you can go for the full head, you can go for half head, you can go for the where most of it's gone and you've just got one or two single seeds kicking about and stuff like that. And again, if you've got a relatively plain background, well, the bokeh bit allows it to really fade out. And it also, you know, other parts of the seed here, you know, it creates these sort of wonderful kind of these rainbow colours coming into it. It's refracting and catching the light, adding this really sort of soft background to it. Sandra says she has been trying to photograph static shots of flowers. VG says this is beautiful, especially with the flowers and pollen. Not sure which bit she was talking about there, but I think probably the one with the bee on it. So you can see then that this kind of thing then is where you can really get into it. Also, silhouettes. Some of you may remember when we were doing silhouettes. You know, this again. What was the? I mean, I've got this on an f8. Now, an f8 normally would give you loads of depth of field, but again, on the macro lens, isn't giving me much. We can zoom into here, and we can see lovely sharpness of the seed heads against this. We've also got the outer focus seed heads, and then the thing is there's these kind of, I don't know if you can just make out sort of pale blurry bits like here. That's actually the little seed heads that are in front of, because it's actually, this is a full one. It's not a half, you know, with half of them missing. This is actually a full one. But it's back to that thing of where you focus. If you focus in on the center of it, which, you know, you can see here a kind of a sharp, that's where it's really focused. And then you're getting the edges, getting that outer edge is the bit that's in focus. And that gives us these beautiful sharp bits here, and then everything else kind of becomes soft as well. So there's lots to play with. There's lots of fun to be had with the dandelion head. And again, so something like this, playing around with the notion of silhouette as well. Sandra says dandelion shots are lovely. Other things, I mean, similar to bees, there's a notion of the dragonfly. You know, yeah. But what I would also say with this is sometimes to be able to get this close, I wasn't actually as close. This then has been cropped in as well. Okay, so the original picture might have been quite a bit bigger than this, and then I've cropped it in further. And at this point, what we're talking about really is the size of your, how many megapixels you've got, the size of your sensor, the quality of your sensor, how much real estate essentially you have, how many pixels you have available to you. And how big have I got this one? This one is, right, this is nearly 3,000 pixels across and 1,700 or 1,800 pixels high. But my original, the original camera on this was something like about 5,500 pixels across. So this bit is occupying a third to a quarter of the amount from the original photo. So the original photo that I took, this is only, you know, this is only about a third to a quarter of that size. I've cut out 2/3 to 3/4 of the picture in order to be able to get in this close. And I wanted it now. The camera I've got is a 45 megapixel camera, so I was able to do that. But if you've got a smaller, my previous camera, I wouldn't have been able to do that. I wouldn't have been able to crop in as close and still retain as much detail. But again, what it does mean is that there's limitations to how large you can actually blow these things up as well. I could print this probably, well, certainly A4 size, maybe A3, you know, 8 by 10, 16 by 24, something like that, wouldn't be. But I couldn't really go above that. Okay, actually not even as much as 16 by 24. Okay, you can work out your own sizes, but the point being is that there's a limitation to how far you can go. So the macro lens plus a good sensor allows you to get in even closer. Another fun one is sometimes that whole exploration is when you get into flowers. You can really get in. You can kind of find, so this is an iris from the garden, and you get these little patterns here. But with all these things, you're still playing around with all the same kind of compositional techniques that we're wondering about. Use of rule of thirds, leading lines, use of diagonals, backlight. All these things are kind of still coming into play. What else have we got here? Where are we? Oh, Sandra says the dandelion shots are lovely. Nick Bath has joined us and says hello, Kim and all. Hi, Nick. Susan says, I agree, Sandra. Dandelion seed heads are my favourite thing to photograph. I have a box full of seeds. And John says he likes the iris photo. Yeah, so this close-up is really giving you a lot of fun. Now, another thing you can do is it's really good for macro lens is when you do the fill the frame. Remember we talked a couple of months back about the notion of the fill the frame. Because the macro can get in so close, you can really fill up. So here we have like a bunch of coffee beans, and you just fill the space with the coffee beans. You can go off to the edges. You don't have to have a bowl or a cup or anything else appearing. You can just kind of fill up the space, and you can get in really close and find all these sort of weird shapes and bits and pieces in the coffee beans that you didn't realise were there, which actually you start to think, do I really want the coffee? So the fill the frame aspect is another great one. So with a macro lens, it allows you to really start going a bit abstract in some ways as well, because it's that notion that you're isolating one area without reference to the other. So you're isolating the inside without reference to the outside. You're isolating a bit of a pattern of a flower or something like that. And you end up with these kind of it becomes more about line and shape sometimes. With this, though, it allows you to really get in close to the coffee and almost kind of smell it. This one again, cut in fairly closer. No, it isn't actually. This is full size. This is full size. This was this was snow. Snow had built up on the fence post, and then the sun had come out and started melting it, and then the sun had just disappeared. This had just dropped back into shadow and started to freeze again. So we've got ice, it's frozen ice. In the background, in fact, is a wall about, 50 to 70 yards away, 50 to 70 metres or thereafter, where the sun is hitting, and you're getting this kind of, or it's a brick wall and the sun's hitting it. It's the end of late afternoon. Sun's hitting the wall, so that's what's giving us the orange colour. The blue in this is where it's refracting the blue sky above. We've got these very abstract shapes, and so this then is full size. I've not had to crop anything in this, so we're not quite as well. You can see down here, practically at snowflake level, where this bit hasn't melted and reformed, but of course it's out of focus. Here you can see that actually little air bubbles have started to form. You can also see sort of bits of ice crystals which have started to melt and started to freeze again. Really quite fun, really, like I say, abstract. Sandra says she likes the ice photo. So there's a lot of fun to be had. You can also go for, this is another favourite of mine, is the tulip. This one always does quite well in the kind of Guru Shots type online web ones as well. So we've got a tulip. We're looking at the tulip straight down. We've talked before about that kind of from above, 90 degrees perpendicular to the image. This one with raindrops on it as well. But the background, the green leaves and what have you, beautiful bokeh. It drops out of focus very, very quickly. This one, again, a 5.6 aperture on it. And in fact, actually, if we just look into this, water bubble here. We can droplet. We can see the trees above me. We can see the shadow. That's me. That's my head holding the camera, and so we've actually got the reflection in the droplet there. But it's a rather kind of pleasing photo. What else? Yeah, again, raindrops, water drops. I mean, Susan's talked before about, you know, if you don't actually have any to hand, you can go out like with a water spray bottle. Perfect kind of thing for playing around with. That macro, that get, you know, these sweet peas, beautiful scent, beautiful patterns and colours, and then with the droplets on them, and that again, that isolating notion, because it's such a narrow depth of field, you get in close, you've got that gorgeous kind of magenta and purple, and then the soft greens in the background. And what else have we got? Mushrooms, of course. You know, as autumn's just around the corner, or fall in North America there, and of course, that means mushroom season. So mushrooms will start coming out. You can get down, you get really close in. You can pick out the individual gills on the mushroom, little bite marks, lots of detail, bits of the moss in the ground. You really feel like you're down there amongst the gnomes and the fairies, or the wood lice and the ants. So it's this kind of thing. This is really where macro comes into its own, I think. So macro photography then is about getting in close, and you can do it with flowers, you can do it with mushrooms, you can do it with coffee beans, you can do it with absolutely anything. And even then, an awful lot of kind of household items and a lot of very ordinary things suddenly have their whole different kind of life to them, an interesting kind of place. Even like a little bit of melted ice, as we saw earlier, suddenly kind of becomes this really abstract sculpture when you go into that macro level. Sandra says she likes the ice photo. Susan says, love the melted snow, opposing colours on the colour wheel are great. And Sandra says, were all these taken with the 100mm lens? So yes, every photo I've just shown you there were taken with the 100mm macro lens. Okay, so that is using for, specifically for macro photography. Now, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk about the notion of how different lenses, how you can use different lenses and sometimes get a macro effect, and sometimes where it kind of works against you, and ways you can kind of get around it. So what I did was a few days ago, especially for this for this podcast, again, I love the high-tech versions of this, or the low-tech rather. I thought, right, actually, what would be useful here is if I just sort of show you what happens with different lenses. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take you to a little setup I did. Okay, so I set up this. Okay, now what this is we've got a table, a little kind of wooden tabletop. I've got a bunch of cones from the garden, and in amongst the cones, just here, you'll see him better from another layer, I've got a little Lego Batman. Okay, so little Lego Batman figure. Well, actually, he was a Lego Batman figure, was on a key ring. The rest of the key ring's gone, so he does have like a little metal stop in the top of his head. But that aside, there we go. So, little Lego Batman sitting in the... is that going to balance back on there again? Might have to work that one out afterwards. Oh well, Batman goes flying. So I thought, okay, let's stick this. I've just got a single light thing sitting off to one side, and I've got a large black book in the background, right? So I'm just setting up a very simple kind of thing. This was kind of off the top of my head, no great depth of planning, but I thought, let's show you. So this is the setup that we're going to play with. Okay. So what I've done here as well is I'm just wanting to show you. So I started off with my camera with my workhorse lens, okay, which is the 24-70. So this is my DSLR, oh, not DSLR, it's a mirrorless Canon R5, and my 24 to 70mm lens is my kind of, this is the one that I have on the camera probably 90% of the time. I don't always have a macro lens. I mean, most of the time, if I'm doing portraits, if I'm doing other scenes, it's the one that's most flexible. I'll stick on the macro if I want to go up close. I'll stick on the zoom lens if I'm out doing concerts or attempting wildlife photography, and I'll stick on the wide angle lens if, you know, for particular, well, whatever I might need that for. Now, the thing is, the key thing here is, right, so here we have what I've got. I've put the information up in the top left corner of these here. So it's the 24 70mm lens, the focal length 24. So what I've done is I've gone wide angle. I've pulled back, and my aperture f5.6. I thought I'll just stick it at 5.6 for these to give you a sense of what's going on. Distance 38 centimeters. It's around about 38 to 40 centimeters. Okay. Now, the point of that distance is that is absolutely as close as I can get with this lens, right? This lens, the focal distance of about 38, I think 38 is what the official one is. You might find that it varies slightly depending on your aperture, but to within a centimetre or two, we'll just go with this. So if I get any closer than this, then our little Batman doesn't appear in focus. And in fact, when I zoom in here, he isn't quite in focus. It's focused on this cone behind. That's where the sharp bit is, and our little Batman isn't quite there. So I've tried to get close, and I've actually just missed it. Okay, so we can see here, you know, out of focus cone here. Focus, the bit that's in focus is actually just behind him. The old problem that we sometimes have. Okay, so I think I'm kind of locking on, but you've got so little leeway. I've gone as close as I possibly can, but this is wide angle. This is wide out. So what I can do though is at this point is I can zoom in. Because this is a 24 to 70, I can take the 70 and I can zoom in. And this then is the same camera sitting in the same position, which, let's go back to here, is about here. I think, I can't remember whether I had to nudge the camera forward or back slightly. Now, it does look like it's slightly closer than that, but bear in mind that what we've got here is this bit. Okay, so that's helping me to keep some extraneous light from hitting the lens and causing lens flare, but it also makes the lens look longer than it actually is. It fits on it to there, so we've kind of got an added few centimeters put on that don't really exist. So the actual part is really here. The lens is from here to Batman here. Right. So let's go back to here and go back. So now zoomed in, I've been taking a slightly more careful. Zoomed in, I'm locked onto the eye of Batman here, and we can see that we kind of got in close. Now, one of the problems you immediately come across is when you do close-up photos as well, that you might not realise. So it's certainly when you kind of into this. So we're moving into this macro area whereby Batman is probably, yeah, it's kind of bigger than the actual figure. Is dust, okay? So we noticed these little bits of dust around him. He looked perfectly clean at my eye level. Once I zoom in on the computer, suddenly he's not. So I'm afraid you will have to put up with a dusty Batman as as we go through this. But so this is what we've got. We've got this setup here. Now the next thing. But that's as far as I can get in. I can't go any closer. Any closer I get, and we run into this problem. If Batman gets out of focus, it starts focusing on the bit behind. There's a limit to how far a normal, your average lens will get, and that will vary. So you can Google it easily enough. Type in your lens, your make, and your model into Google, and say minimal focal length or something like that of this lens, and it will tell you how close you can get. But you also know that you can get in so far and it will stop. So can I make this any bigger? If this is the only lens I've got, well, there is one thing you can do, and that is magnifying glass. Okay. Right, so a magnifying glass can play around with that. And now, so what you can do then is you can actually stick a magnifying glass in front of the lens. Now again, you can play around with it. I've just done one quick version of this, but you place the magnifying glass, you can move it further or closer away, you can zoom in, you can zoom out, all these kind of things. But with that in mind, I was then able to get this shot. So when we compare this with this, we can see that I've got a bit closer. Now, so I can actually get in even closer to Batman than I did before. Now, obviously at this point, the magnifying glass itself is starting to appear in the shot. But depending on where I was going to crop this, if I was going to crop it here, then you wouldn't necessarily know. The other problem you also run into is, first of all, the cheapness of your magnifying glass. Obviously, the cheaper ones don't tend to, the quality of magnification doesn't tend to be so great. It might be sharper in the middle and much more blurrier at the edges. And of course, depending on the angle of the light, depends on whether you end up the light actually catching. So we can see here that the light itself is catching into the magnifying glass as well. So the angle of the light, you've got another piece of glass that's out in the open, is catching reflections left, right and centre. So it's not always the easiest thing to do, but the point is that this is giving you an extra level of magnification to play around with. So don't, look around. You can sometimes buy a cheap set of multiple sizes of magnifying glasses. You obviously need one that's going to kind of match up with the size of your lens. There's a little point in having a tiny little magnifying glass if your lens is much wider, because you're not going to be able to see through it. But I would say play around with magnifying glasses. So let's show, so we've got that then as a kind of a standard lens. But what if I was to use a zoom lens, a big chunky zoom lens? So I have a 70 to 200mm lens. So this is my big nice telephoto lens that I can use for zooming in on things. So now the big problem I have here is when I show you the setup here, there's a much bigger gap between the end of the lens and our little Batman and cones. Okay, so why is this so much further away? This is so much further away because the focal point is much, the focal distance, the minimum focal distance is much wider. This is designed for photographing birds in trees, for photographing rock stars up on stage. It's not designed for macro. It's designed to pick things off at a distance. And this means my minimum length, my minimum focal length for this is 1.2 meters. So just showing you from a slightly different angle. So here we go, right? So focal length, and now this one, 70 to 200. So I've pulled this back to the 70 to show you what it looks like. But my distance is 1.2 meters. Now I've got a little flicker. If I click it, it can be a minimal distance of 2.5 meters, but I have an option to click it over so I can get a minimal distance of 1.2. So 1.2 at 70 isn't that different to, where was I earlier? It was that one, which was my 70mm lens at 24. Okay, so pull right, only I'm a bit further back. And then, but if I now zoom in and I do my 200mm and I go, so from I'm just over a meter away, 200mm, straight in, zoom in, this is as close as I can get. Which, again, if I go back to the 70mm lens here, isn't a million miles away from that. So my 20 to 70mm lens, closer, is very similar, fractionally closer, than my zoom lens at 200mm. So I might have 200mm, which is twice as much as the 100mm macro, but I've got to be much further away before I can use it. So it's not really working as a macro lens. And then if I try sticking the magnifying glass in front of it, well, yeah, it's not really working so well. It's not really, I can't, I've now got to be so far away that the whole of the magnifying glass is sticking in front of it. I'm now getting into the quality, the light is reflecting off the magnifying glass. It's not really doing it. Oh, I see Nadia's joined us as well. Hi Nadia, glad you could make it along. So whilst you can kind of sometimes get that macro, you know, you've just got to keep that distance. So you might be shooting a bird in a tree, or you might be or on a bird feeder, or you might be shooting some bits of fruit hanging down or something like that. But you know, this is your problem, is the limitation. So what else can you do? So if we actually go then to, this is the macro lens. So if I get the macro lens, this is a 100. So it's only half the amount of my 200, but I can get closer. And this is the real bit, is compared to the, you know, my 2470, I could get to 38 centimeters. This will allow me to get to my 100mm macro, will allow me to get to about a 30mm distance. Now, I start off, I've pulled back to get a similar kind of thing. This was about as close as I managed to get with my 2470, right? And I'm back at about 50 centimeters here. I just want to kind of get a sense of it being a fairly similar distance. But if I go right up to 30 centimeters, now 30 centimeters is as close as I can get. This is my limitation. But we can now see that I'm in an awful lot closer. The dust is really showing up well. We've also, at 5.6 though, we've now got a really narrow depth of field. We can see down here on the Batman logo on his chest that a lot of it's gone out. I've only got the tip of it in focus, really, more of his shoulder. Most of this is slightly out of focus. So now if I'm going as close as I can get, then we're kind of at dodgy levels here. Now I can, if I want, then stick a magnifying glass in front of that again, and I can get even closer. But you've not got as much leeway as to forward and back with the magnifying glass. The other problem is at this point is we come down to the quality of the glass, the fact that it's catching the light. Actually, I might be closer to begin with, but I've lost such quality that if I zoom in, the quality isn't really there. I am actually better off having less in front of. You know, the quality of the glass in the lens itself is superb. It's infinitely better than a magnifying glass. So actually the magnifying glass is playing against me on this. I'm better off taking the photo and then, if I really wanted, zooming in and cropping, because again I've got a 45 megapixel camera. I've got a lot of real estate to play around with. Having said that, there's maybe not quite so much that's actually that interesting in this. So that's what we're kind of up against. Now, with that in mind, hang on a sec, what else have we got here? So, VG says, I've heard about extension tubes. Would that work? Now, yeah, extension tubes can kind of work, but there are still limitations to them. Now, there's a couple of different things you can get. You can get like little extension bits which you stick really between. Now, sticking a tube onto the end of your lens isn't really going to do anything. Because all you're really doing is just, you know, it's like sticking a cardboard tube over your eye. You're not going to see anything with it. Where extension tubes happen is actually you place them, the things that happen between the lens and the camera. Okay, so something's going in here. And what that's doing is it's kind of pushing out focal distances. It's getting the lens a little bit closer to the object. And if you've got the right bit in between here, then you can sometimes, that allows you to get closer. And to, so yeah, there are things you can do to play around with that. That's true. Another option though that I really wanted to talk about was to talk about your phone. Okay, so actually let's just take that out a minute. And so your phone has a little camera bit on the back and probably a camera bit on the front. There's a little camera bit on the front there as well, so you can do your selfies. Now, some phones have a built-in macro bit to them. You can get in really close. Now, the thing is with this, actually, generally speaking, you can get in pretty close anyway, but it doesn't necessarily have the macro bit. And if I go to, so here was my phone. So I've got a Google Pixel 7. So that's what I'm working with. And you know, some of you have got iPhones, some of you have got Samsungs, some of you have got Nokias, some of you have got all sorts of different things. Now, I've got options here on, so when I do something like this, I've got an option. It defaults to a ratio of 1, and then underneath that 0.7 gives me a wide angle, kind of gets more of me in, and a 2 gives me double. Okay, so you can see that that's zoomed in on my face here. So the 1 is, that's kind of giving us the kind of ordinary ratio. So on this image here, I've got it on 1, and I've got my distance is approximately, give or take a bit, 15 centimeters or thereabouts, and that's again as close as I could get before it started. My phone started moaning at me, telling me to move back a bit to get a better picture. Right? It couldn't guarantee that it was going to focus in any closer than that. However, that's on the 1. If I press the 2, then I got this, and as we can see, this is not bad at all. This is really getting quite close. So when we compare that to, now it's not quite comparable with the macro lens where I got in this close, but you know, the macro lens is a little bit further back, and certainly it's comparable. It's, you know, it's doing better than where were we? Which was my, say, yeah, it's even better than the 2470 with the magnifying glass, or the 2470 without the magnifying glass. You see, this is bigger. Okay, so actually your phone can sometimes get in closer. Now, it is worth remembering with your phone, however, that your phone probably doesn't have the same number or quality of megapixels that your DSLR or your mirrorless is likely to have. But if we're talking about something for the web, you know, this really isn't bad. And on top of that, most of it's in focus as well. So it's not just the eye that's in focus, but you know, you can see the whole of the Batman logo on his chest there is in focus. We can now see lots of dust, even on the hands as well. There's dust all over the place. So actually, sometimes your phone is really doing it. But, and here's the secret weapon. Here's the bit that I really wanted to talk about with your phone, which is to get yourself a jeweler's loupe. So a loupe, L-O-U-P-E, right? Now, see this? See how close you can get with that? And what you're doing here is you take your little jeweler's loupe here. So let's just show you that. These things are cheap. These things are, oh, there goes the phone. These things are £10, less than £10, $10 less. You know, you can pick them up on Amazon really quickly. You can probably pick them up elsewhere but they are quite incredible. Now they're designed for really super close up. Now what you can do with that is you can take this and you can stick it over the end of the phone like that. And if I, so we have this, and if I put this over here, and how close can we get in? I'll go to there. I don't think this is necessarily going to work. Really difficult to line up. Okay, we'll not worry too much. But the thing is that as we can see on our Batman, it gets us super close in. Okay. That level of detail I'm not even getting with my macro lens. Sorry, this picture. See, it's giving us, you know, incredible levels of detail. And at this point, my distance is approximately 2 centimeters. Okay, so whereas I'm always limited by how close I can get with my macro lens, I can't get closer than 30 centimeters. With my phone, I can't get closer than 15 centimeters. With my phone and a jeweler's lens, I can get as close as 2 centimeters. Now, again, this is creating, it's very much, it's a sharp center and it blurs out very quickly on it. There is something about the quality of these, but play around. You can also, I will say, you can get, again, not very expensive, though I've not tried it, so I can't guarantee the quality. But again, you go to, you know, anywhere online, you can get a bunch of additions like macro and telephoto lenses specifically designed for camera phones, or phone cameras. Okay, so that's another way of playing around. You know, do use your phone as well. I think that can be quite a fun way of getting into macro photography. Sandra says, I noticed you had a full setting on the side of your macro lens. I wondered what that was. Full setting. I'm not totally sure what you mean with that one. on the side of the macro lens. Oh, right, okay, full, yes. So what we're talking about here, I don't know if you can quite make it out, I'll just move this. On the macro lens, I've got 3 different settings. So I've got a 0.3 setting, a 0.5 setting, and a full setting. So the 0.3 meters, what this means is if I'm taking the photo within 30 centimeters, 0.3 of a meter, and I'm only going to be taking the photo. It's not the focal, when you put it on autofocus, or when you press your little focus button and it autofocuses, it's only going to focus within that range. It's not going to bother looking to focus way out of the range. If I put it on the middle one, into the medium, the 0.5, it's only going to focus within 50 centimeters. Okay, so it's going to sort of stretch out. It will look for whatever it is within that, but it won't go beyond. When I've got it on full, and it does, and I put it on autofocus, it's going to look the full length of what happens. So if I could point this camera at the library, out of the window, across the road, and it will focus on that, and I can use it just like I would any other lens, just like a normal, 100mm lens. It can operate as a normal 100mm. It doesn't have to be a macro lens. And in fact, in that sense, there are people I know who use these macro lenses sometimes as portrait lenses. They do make pretty good portrait lenses because of that kind of relatively narrow depth of focus, because of the way they're done. Obviously, you're not wanting a portrait lens where you're picking out people's spots or you're only looking at their nose. But if somebody goes and stands 10 feet away from you, then you can use this as a macro. But for that, you would need to have this on full rather than, because if you have it on 0.5 or 0.3, it's only going to look for a focal point between 0.3 and 0.5. It's not going to give you a focal length of something that's 10 feet away. I hope that makes sense, Sandra. Good question, that though. Good question. So that kind of really, I think, kind of sums up what I was trying to get across with macro photography. So if you've got a macro lens, get out there and play with it. If things are moving too fast because you're trying to, the wind's blowing things in the garden, or there's bees moving around, and that's a harder thing. I mean, go for a higher shutter speed, go for an auto ISO, pray that you have a fast reacting autofocus. If you want a little bit more control, don't go out on a windy day. Take things, stick them in a little studio, stick them by the window, get plenty of light. Play around in the same way that you would with any kind of still life. Okay, your shutter speed, obviously you need if you're doing it by hand, you need a shutter speed above something like 160th of a second if you don't want hand wobble to come into it, or you stick it on a tripod and do the 2-second timer, as we've talked about, or a 10-second timer. But play around, and if you don't have a macro lens, then at the very least use your ordinary lens, but zoom in as far as you can. You come back as far as you can to make sure it's in focus, but use the zoom. And if all else fails, use your phone, and then use your phone and variation of magnifying glasses. All these kind of things give you access to the world of macro photography, which is a lot of fun. It kind of takes you into that place where you can do, like I say, fill the frame, you can do abstract, you can find really interesting shapes and lines that are normally lost to you. Your biggest problem is that it does also pick up the dust and the bits that you weren't really you're ideally wanting to come into. But hopefully that all gives you a better idea. So ultimately then, to go back to the very beginning, a macro shot, the definition of a macro shot is that it's a ratio of a minimum of 1:1, so that the image, the picture is at least life size. And if the picture itself is bigger than the actual object that you're photographing, or the subject that you're photographing, then even better. That's really what macro is all about. So with all that in mind, I'm setting the macro challenge. Okay, so this came from Robert. So Robert in Texas, Robert Gullick, He won the most Smug Points last month. He got to set the challenge. He decided he wanted to have a macro challenge. So today's talk, all about macro photography, is to give you ideas, to give you a bit of background so that you can enter the macro challenge for 2 weeks' time. Okay, so what is it? It's the 11th today. So on the 25th of August, that's when we'll have the... so everybody send me your images. Get them in, obviously, before the 25th, ideally before the 23rd, so that I've got time to organise and set this podcast up as best as I can. So macro challenge. So Robert, you absolutely have to enter it now that you've put... But everybody else, have a go. Have a go. Use your phone, use magnifying glasses, use your macro lens, use whatever you can. Play with it. Get in there, have fun with the macro challenge. And then I'd be really looking forward to seeing what you're going to come up with. A couple of comments here. What have we got? Oh, Sandra says, that was really helpful as my macro lens has those settings, but I didn't understand what they were for. Excellent, that's good. Robert says, thanks for the podcast. I'm looking forward to using these techniques in the next few days, and macro challenge accepted. And Fiji says, thanks, Robert, for suggesting the podcast theme. I'm looking forward to the next challenge on macro. Excellent. So next week then, now, there are going to be slots for feedback. So if you would like feedback on your images, if you've got a photo, you want to whether critique, feedback, you want to get some idea of how to improve it, send me your image. I've probably got room for 2 or 3 of those. The other thing is, and I'm still toying with it, but I think I probably am going to go for it, is I want to give a little bit of a talk about the sense of entitlement that sometimes comes with photographers. I've witnessed a few things recently or over the years where some people, once they've got a camera, kind of feel that they can go all out and they're going to get the shot they want, regardless of how anybody else feels about it, including the people they might actually be photographing. And there's a whole kind of interesting topic, I think, there that I want to explore. I think actually what I might do is, even if you're on the Facebook group of the Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres Facebook group, I think I'm probably going to shove a post in and ask for your own experiences of the notion of photography and entitlement and power relationships. I think power relationships within photography are really interesting. So I want to explore that a little bit next week. But I will also be doing having a section on feedback, so I can have a couple of those. So make sure you put your images in. Don't forget, if you put images in which I then use for feedback, you get a bonus 25 Smug Points. So don't miss out on that either. Sandra says, my everyday lenses are 24 to 105 and the macro is also 105. Am I right in thinking the reason I can get closer with the macro lens is the difference in focal length? Yes, that's it precisely. It looks like that buffering might be okay, not sure. But yes, you're absolutely right. The macro lens is designed for the focal length for you to get closer. So even though you've got a 105mm telephoto lens, the 105mm macro lens is designed to be closer. So that's why you can get in closer with that. Susan says entitlement, that's going to be really interesting, I think. Good, I do hope so. Right, so keep an eye out in the Facebook group, because I'm going to put something in and I want your take and thoughts and stories on this so that I can put all this together ready for next week. Send me your images if you're wanting feedback, and start thinking about your macro challenge. Go out and get yourself grab your grandchildren's magnifying glasses from a kit that, science kit that you bought them, or anything like that, and see what kind of fun you can have. So thank you ever so much for turning up, for leaving comments, and I look forward to seeing you all next week. Take care. Bye-bye.